My cold alpha wife stopped sleeping in her own room the night I had a nightmare. She never went back to it. Not once. Not for a single night in the 2 years since. And if you had told me on my wedding day that this was where we would end up, I would have laughed you out of the room. The kind of laugh that costs you your last shred of dignity, because that morning I was still trying to remember how to breathe around her, and she was still calling me an arrangement instead of a name. My name is Wren Calloway. I was 26 years old, an omega, and for most of my life I had been the kind of person a room forgets is in it. I answered phones at my father's machine shop. I filed invoices nobody read. I kept the real books in a spiral notebook under my mattress because the official ledger, the one the accountants signed off on, had been lying for 14 months, and I was the only person in Calloway Machine Works who had noticed. I noticed because numbers don't lie the way people do. A column either balances or it doesn't. My father, Edmund Calloway, had built that shop with his hands and his back and a war-era loan he never fully paid off, and by the spring I turned 26, the shop owed more to Vantry Holdings than it was worth. I knew the exact figure, $412,000. I had counted it more times than I had counted my own birthdays. The morning the men in gray suits came to change the locks, my father sat at the kitchen table with his hands flat on the wood like he was trying to keep it from floating away. I stood in the doorway in my work apron, smelling burnt coffee and fear, and I thought, this is the day we lose everything. And then the phone rang. And it wasn't the bank. It was a woman's assistant, calling to say that Miss Vantry required our presence at her offices at 10 o'clock sharp, and that failure to appear would be noted. Not requested. Required, I had heard of Josephine Vantry the way you hear of weather systems. Something enormous, something that reorganized the sky wherever it moved. The papers called her the Winter Ledger, because she balanced people the way I balanced numbers and never once carried a remainder. She had inherited an empire of ports and freight lines from a father who died with his jaw still clenched, and in 6 years she had doubled it, and buried, along the way, any rumor that she had ever wanted anything softer than a signature on a contract. I put on my one good coat. My father put on his only tie. We drove into the city in a truck that coughed at every red light, and I did not know yet that I was driving toward the only person who would ever stay. That was the collision. It came for us in a glass tower 40 floors above a river neither of us could afford to look at. The conference room smelled like money and lemon polish. Marcus Vantry sat at the head of it before his cousin ever arrived, tapping a folder against the table like a man setting a metronome for his own cruelty. He was handsome in the way spoiled things are handsome, soft around a jaw that had never done a day's work. He looked at my father the way you look at a debt with legs. $412,000, he said, plus interest, plus the cost of these very inconvenient meetings, brings the total to $460. Unless, he smiled at me like I was a line item, unless we can find another kind of currency. My father's hand found mine under the table. I did not know yet what Marcus meant. I would. The door opened at exactly 10 o'clock, and the whole room's temperature dropped 2 degrees before I ever saw her face. She was tall in the way a held breath is tall. Black suit, no jewelry but a single steel cuff at one wrist, hair pulled back hard enough to look like a decision rather than a style. She did not sit. She stood at the window with the river behind her and said, without turning, "Explain the shortfall in the third quarter freight allocation, Marcus, the one that doesn't reconcile with the manifest." A clerical error. Joe, nothing that concerns the Calloways. I don't know what made me speak. Maybe it was the notebook under my mattress, the 14 months of numbers I had memorized out of pure survival. Maybe it was that I was tired, bone-tired, of watching men decide my father's fate in a language they thought I didn't understand. "It's not a clerical error," I said. "It's $22,000 moved through a shell account registered to a supplier that stopped operating in March. I've seen the pattern before. In my father's books, someone's been skimming both companies the same way." The room went silent in a manner I can only describe as expensive. Marcus's face did something ugly and fast before he smoothed it. "Who is this?" "My daughter," my father said, quiet and proud despite everything. "Wren does our books." For the first time, Josephine Vantry turned around. Her eyes were the gray of a sky before it decides what kind of storm it wants to be, and they went to me and stayed there, and I felt it the way you feel a hand close around your wrist. Under the lemon polish and the cold air conditioning, I caught something else. Black pepper, rain on hot steel. It should have meant nothing to me. It didn't. "Say that again," she said. Slowly, I said it again. Slowly, when I finished, she looked at Marcus for a long moment, and something passed between them that I did not yet have the context to read, and then she said the words that ended one life and began another. "The debt is forgiven." A pause, precise as a scalpel. "In exchange for a marriage. Mine to your daughter. The contract will be drawn by Friday." My father made a sound like a man who has been holding his breath since 1990. I made no sound at all. I was too busy trying to place the scent of rain and steel, and failing to understand that I would spend the rest of my life learning it by heart. The wedding, when it came, was smaller than my humiliation and faster than my grief. 9 people in a marble room that smelled of white lilies and legal ink. My father cried. Marcus did not attend, which I would later understand was not an absence but a strategy. Josephine Vantry wore black to her own wedding and told the officiant to skip the parts about love. She did not kiss me. She shook my hand, the way you close a deal, and said, "You'll have your own wing. Your own staff. Nothing will be required of you beyond appearances." Her scent flared for 1 second, sharp as a struck match, gone before I could name what had caused it. Then she turned and left me standing in my mother's altered wedding dress, a stranger's ring heavy and cold on my finger, listening to the sound of 40 floors of glass close over my old life like water over a stone. That night, a car took me to the Vantry estate, up a drive lined with black iron gates that opened for no one who hadn't been expected. I sat with my hands folded over a suitcase that held everything I owned, including a small ceramic lamp with a hairline crack down its base, the one my mother had given me before she died, the one I could not sleep without because the dark, since I was small, had never once been kind to me. I did not know, riding up that drive, that the lamp would matter. I did not know that a woman who refused to kiss me at our own wedding would, before the year was out, learn to switch it on for me with her own hand and never, ever switch it off again. The gates closed behind the car with a sound like a verdict. The house rose in front of me, all black stone and lit windows, and somewhere inside it a woman who smelled of rain and steel was already deciding how little of herself she would let me have. I would spend the next several months proving her wrong about that, 1 inch at a time, and she did not make it easy. The house had 41 rooms, and I was given exactly one of them. My wing sat at the east end of a corridor so long that my footsteps echoed back at me like a second judgmental person. A woman named Beatrice Long, who ran the household staff with the warmth of a filing cabinet, showed me through it on my first morning and made sure I understood, without ever raising her voice, that I was an inconvenience being managed rather than a wife being welcomed. "Miss Vantry keeps to the west wing," she said, gesturing down a hallway I was apparently not to walk. She dines alone. She does not require company at breakfast, and she does not appreciate surprises. Her eyes moved over my one good coat, my department store shoes, the suitcase I hadn't yet unpacked. I imagine this is all very overwhelming for someone from your background. It was not kindness. It was a door closing, dressed up as a tour. I learned the shape of the house the way I had learned my father's books, by finding what didn't add up. A locked room at the end of the west corridor that Mrs. Aldous, the housekeeper, hurried me past with her eyes down. A portrait in the library of a woman with Joe's exact bone structure and none of her armor, painted in oils gone soft with age. Her nameplate reading Eleanor Vantry beneath dates that made her 31 when she died. A house with more staff than laughter, more silver than warmth, and a mistress who ate dinner behind a closed door every single night, while her new wife sat in a dining room built for 40 and ate alone. Joe Vantry did not come near me for the first 9 days. I saw her twice, both times from a distance, both times in motion, a black coat and a phone pressed to her ear, and a wake of silence that followed her down every hallway she walked. Her scent lingered after her the way smoke lingers after a fire has already moved on. Rain struck flint. Something colder underneath that I hadn't yet learned the name of. On the 10th night, I found a tray outside my door. Chamomile tea, made with too much honey, the exact way my mother used to make it, and a plate of the roast chicken I had picked at during dinner 3 nights earlier without finishing. I stood in the corridor holding the tray with both hands and felt something in my chest do a slow, confused turn, because I had told no one about the honey. I had told no one about the chicken. Someone had been paying attention to a woman she pretended not to see. It wasn't kindness that made me set the tray down carefully instead of gulping the tea in the doorway. It was recognition. Someone in this enormous cold house had noticed me the way I noticed numbers. Quietly, precisely, without being asked. I asked Mrs. Aldous about it the next morning, over the eggs I was still learning to eat alone without feeling like a specimen. Miss Vantry doesn't like waste, she said, not meeting my eyes, which told me it was a lie built to protect someone. She notices what leaves the kitchen untouched. She counts my leftovers. She counts everything, Mrs. Aldous said, and there was something almost fond buried under the correction, quickly hidden. She has, since she was a girl, a pause waited since her mother. I set down my fork, the portrait in the library. Mrs. Aldous's hands stilled over the teapot. That's not a story that's mine to tell, Mrs. Vantry. I did not correct the name. I was starting to want it, in a way that frightened me more than the empty dining room ever had. I found Jo herself 3 days later, by accident, in the one place in the house that felt lived in rather than displayed, a glassed-in room off the kitchen garden, full of half-dead orchids she was apparently trying and failing to keep alive. She had her sleeves rolled to the elbow and dirt under her nails, and for one unguarded second, before she heard me in the doorway, her face wasn't the Winter Ledger's face at all. It was tired. It was young. It was for exactly as long as it took her to notice me, unarmored. Then it closed, the way a hand closes around something it doesn't want examined. "You're not permitted in this wing without notice," she said. I got lost. That was half true. I didn't know you gardened. I don't. I fail at it, repeatedly, and refuse to stop. She set down a pair of shears with more precision than the sentence required. Was there something you needed? I could have said no. I could have retreated the way 9 days of silence had trained me to. Instead, I said, "Thank you for the tea." And the chicken. Something flickered through her scent, gone as fast as it came, warmer than rain, closer to something I didn't yet have a name for. "The staff manage the kitchens," she said. "I have very little to do with it." It was the first lie I ever caught her in, and I let her have it, because I understood, even then, that some doors open slower than others, and this one had been shut for a very long time before I arrived to knock on it. I reached for a low orchid stem drooping over its pot and repositioned it toward the light without thinking, the way you'd fix a column that didn't balance. Our hands brushed. Hers were warm, which surprised me more than it should have. She went very still, the way a held breath goes still, and for 3 full seconds neither of us moved, and the little glass room filled with the smell of rain on hot stone and something underneath it that I would later learn to call longing. "You should go," she said. But she didn't step back, and neither did I. "Vantries do not flinch," she added, so quietly I almost missed it, like a rule she was reciting to herself rather than to me. Then she did step back, and the door closed behind her face again, and I was left standing among the dying orchids with my pulse going too fast for a hand that had barely touched mine. I didn't know then that the phrase was her father's, worn smooth from repetition. The one doctrine he had left her instead of love. I didn't know it would take a nightmare to make her break it. I found out 3 days after that, standing in Marcus Vantry's shadow in a parking garage that smelled of exhaust and old rain, that not everyone in that family was interested in doors opening at all. He was waiting by my car when I came out of the grocery store, a small errand I'd insisted on running myself just to feel like a person with a life rather than a line item. He smiled the way men like him always do, like a debt about to be collected. "Wren," he said, testing the shape of my name in his mouth, like he was deciding whether it was worth the effort. "How's married life? Does she let you out of the house often, or is this a special occasion? I don't answer to you." "No," he agreed, "easily you answer to my cousin, which is worse, though you don't know it yet." He leaned against my car door, blocking it. "Your father's books. The ones you've been so clever about. I'd think very carefully about how loudly you talk about shell accounts and shortfalls, if I were you. Some columns balance better when the person who found them stops looking." My pulse spiked, cold instead of warm this time. "Is that a threat?" "It's an invitation," he said, "to remember which family is protecting which. Vantry money forgave your father's debt. Vantry money could just as easily discover new irregularities in his old accounts. Fraud charges take a long time to unwind, even for the innocent, especially for the poor." His eyes flicked over my grocery bags, my coat, cataloging my worth the way I cataloged numbers. "You're not the first bought bride to think she's found a home here. You won't be the last to learn otherwise." He stepped aside, unhurried, and let me get into my car, and I drove home with my hands shaking on the wheel and a fear in my chest that had nothing to do with numbers and everything to do with the particular shape of a man who has never once in his life been told no and meant it. That night, I lay in my too-large bed under the ceiling of a house I did not yet trust, and I understood, with a cold, arithmetic clarity, that the $412,000 had never been the real debt. It had only ever been the down payment on something Marcus Vantry intended to collect in full, and I had no idea yet what currency he meant to take it in. I fell asleep counting exits, the way my father had taught me during storms as a child, and I did not know that somewhere down the hall, a woman who never came near my wing was about to hear me scream. The nightmare came for me the way it always had, since I was 9 years old, and standing in a doorway watching men load my mother's things into a van, because grief doesn't wait for you to be ready for it. In the dream, it was always the same house, the same men, Except this time, the men wore Marcus's face and multiplied it, and my father was being led away in handcuffs made of ledger paper, and I was screaming a name I hadn't earned the right to scream yet, and no one came. I woke myself up, shouting. Actually shouting, my throat raw with it, my sheets soaked through, my heart going so hard I could feel it in my teeth. The room was dark in the particular suffocating way that rooms get when you've forgotten, for one terrible half-second, where you are and whether you're safe there. The door opened before I'd even found the lamp switch. She was in the doorway in a plain gray shirt, hair loose for the first time I'd ever seen it, feet bare on the cold floor, and she did not ask permission to cross the room. She crossed it the way you cross toward a fire alarm, fast and certain, and she was at the side of my bed before I'd even gotten my breathing back under something resembling control. Wren, my name, not an appearance or a Mrs. Vantry, just my name, low and urgent. You're safe, look at me. I looked at her. Gray eyes gone soft with something I hadn't seen on her before, not once, not even in the orchid room. Rain and steel, and underneath it now, an edge of something warmer, something like fear for someone other than herself. I heard you 3 rooms away, she said, through walls that cost more than most houses. I heard you. I'm sorry, I said, stupidly, because I didn't yet know how to receive being cared for without apologizing for the inconvenience of needing it. You didn't have to stop, not unkind. Absolute, the way all her sentences were absolute. Tell me what you need. I hadn't been asked that question by anyone in longer than I could remember. I found myself reaching, without deciding to, for the little ceramic lamp on my nightstand, the one with the crack down its base, my mother's lamp, the one I hadn't been able to sleep without since I was 9 years old and the world had first proven it could take everything from you in a single afternoon. Joe's eyes went to it. She didn't ask why. She reached over, found the switch with her own hand, and turned it on, and the small warm circle of light it threw across the room seemed to cost her something to give, the way everything real costs something. Tell me you'll stop screaming if I sit here, she said. I don't know if I can promise that. Then I'll stay until you can. She sat on the edge of the bed, not touching me, close enough that I could feel the warmth coming off her like a held breath finally let out. I told her, because the dark makes confessions easier, about the men loading the van, about being 9, about my mother's slow decline and my father's debt, and every version of losing everything I'd ever survived. I did not tell her about Marcus in the parking garage. Not yet. Some fears you have to earn the right to hand someone before you trust them to carry it well. She listened. She didn't fill the silences with reassurance she didn't mean. When I finally ran out of words, she said, quietly, almost to herself, my mother used to hum when the house got too quiet. I used to think it was for her. I understand now it might have been for me. And then, so low I almost missed it under the hum of the ceiling fan, she began to hum something, tuneless and uncertain, and it took me 3 full bars to recognize the shape of it as close enough to a lullaby fragment my own father used to sing that my chest cracked open in a way that had nothing to do with fear. Tell me to leave, she said when the humming stopped, and I will. Don't, I said. Please don't. She didn't. She stayed sitting upright against my headboard until my breathing evened out, and sometime near dawn, still not touching me, she fell asleep sitting up like a woman standing guard even in unconsciousness, and I woke to gray morning light and the lamp still burning, and a warmth beside me that smelled like rain on hot steel, and, for the first time since I'd arrived in that enormous cold house, like safety. She never went back to her own room after that. Not that night, not any night after it. I didn't understand yet what it had cost her to break her father's oldest rule for a woman she'd married for a debt. I only knew that something in the house had shifted its foundation, quietly, permanently, the way a house settles after a long winter, and neither of us said a single word about it in the morning. We didn't talk about the nightmare that first week. We didn't have to. Talking would have made it fragile, and neither of us trusted yet that it could survive being named out loud. Instead, Joe simply began appearing. At breakfast, across the too large table, close enough now that our conversation didn't need shouting. In the doorway of my room each night, a small nod that was permission asked without words, and I always nodded back. It was in the second week of this new, unspoken arrangement that she told me about her mother properly, sitting on the floor of the orchid room with her back against a cracked terracotta pot, dirt still under her nails from a losing battle with a stem she refused to let die. My father used to say love was a currency that only ever devalued, she said, not looking at me, looking at the orchid instead, like it was easier to confess to something that couldn't judge her. He said it the way other fathers teach their daughters to ride bicycles, constantly, patiently, like it was a kindness. And your mother? Believed him first, then didn't. By the time she stopped believing him, she'd already spent 31 years married to a man who never once let her see him unguarded. She didn't die of anything a doctor could name on a chart. She just stopped, the way a clock stops, not from breaking, from simply running out of reasons to keep going. Her jaw worked. I was 12. I decided that day I would never let anyone see enough of me to do that to me. Control, not love. Love is what killed her. Is that why the separate rooms? I said. Why you told the officiant to skip the parts about love? I told myself I married you for a debt I could afford to forgive. She turned to look at me then, gray eyes steady, unguarded in a way I hadn't earned yet the right to see. I've since discovered I'm a worse liar than I thought I was. I reached for her hand where it rested on the floor between us, and this time she let me take it, and did not pull away, and her scent bloomed warm and open around us both, rain giving way to something like sun breaking through cloud cover. My mother used to say the ones who stay are the ones who matter, I told her, not the ones who promise. I think I've spent my whole life waiting to find out if that was true, or if it was just something you tell a 9-year-old so she'll stop crying. It's true, Joe said, low, certain, the most unguarded sentence I'd heard her speak. I intend to prove it. Slowly, if you'll let me. I told her then about Marcus in the parking garage. I watched her face do something I hadn't seen it do before. Not the cold, controlled fury of the boardroom, but something quieter and more dangerous, the stillness of a woman recalculating an old, familiar threat into an entirely new category. He's threatened your father before, she said. Hasn't he? Before the marriage. How did you know? Because that's what he does, she said. He finds the weight-bearing wall in a person and leans on it until something gives. Her hand tightened around mine. He won't get near your father again. I promise you that. It was a promise I would watch her keep, and one I would watch cost her everything she thought she had left to lose. But that night, in the orchid room, it felt like the first true thing anyone had ever handed me without a price attached. We had 11 quiet weeks after that. 11 weeks of tea made exactly right, of her hand finding mine under tables she'd once made sure stayed empty, of a first kiss in the library under her mother's portrait that neither of us planned and both of us meant, slow and asking, her forehead against mine afterward, both of us breathing like we'd run somewhere important. 11 weeks of a house learning to be warm. Then the calls started. Reporters, first, then board members. Then, on a Tuesday morning I will never fully stop replaying, a courier delivering a manila envelope to the front gates, addressed to every major outlet in the city, containing documents that said, in language cold and official enough to be believed, that Wren Calloway had embezzled $40,000 from her own father's failing company in the 6 months before her marriage, using the funds to secure herself a wealthy alpha wife before her family's fraud could be discovered. I read it standing in the front hall in my bathrobe, while Joe's phone rang itself hoarse in the next room, and I understood, with the particular clarity of a woman watching her own life get rewritten by someone else's hand, exactly whose signature belonged underneath the lie. The photograph on the front page the next morning was the worst image I have ever seen of myself, caught mid-flinch on the front steps of the estate, surrounded by shouted questions, Joe's hand gripping my arm not in comfort, but in the visible, brittle control of a woman trying not to break something in public. The headline did not use my name. It used the word bride and the word fraud in the same 6 words, and underneath it, smaller, a line that undid me more than the accusation itself. Sources close to the Vantry family confirm an internal investigation has been opened. I stood in the doorway of Joe's study that evening and watched her, jaw locked, giving instructions into a phone in the flat, controlled voice she used with the board, the voice I hadn't heard directed at anyone since the day we met, and I understood, with a cold drop in my stomach, that the mask I'd watched her slowly remove for 11 weeks had just been forced back onto her face by a threat neither of us had built strong enough walls against. "You need to stay in your wing until this clears," she said, not quite looking at me, her voice gone careful in a way that felt, for the first time since the lamp, like distance. "The board is demanding a statement. I need to control the narrative before." "Before what?" I said. "Before you decide whether the accusation might be true?" Her eyes snapped to mine, and for one unguarded second I saw exactly how much that question had cost her to hear. But she didn't answer it fast enough, and the silence that followed was the worst image of the entire story. The two of us standing 8 feet apart in a room full of warm lamplight, further from each other than we had been the night I woke up, screaming. I was still assembling proof of my own innocence at 2 a.m, when I found the pattern that changed everything. I hadn't stopped keeping my own ledger, the private one, the habit of 14 months that had never fully left me even in a house full of accountants who did the real work. I pulled every number I had quietly cross-referenced since the day in Marcus's boardroom. The shell account, the shortfall, the supplier that stopped operating in March, and I laid them beside the doctored embezzlement documents leaked to the press. And there it was, glaring, absurd. The kind of mistake only a man who had never once been questioned in his life would make. The $40,000 supposedly stolen by me had been routed through the exact same shell account I had, flagged in that very first meeting, 7 months before my wedding, before I had ever set foot in Vantry Holdings books at all. He hadn't just framed me. He'd used his own laundering pipeline to do it, too arrogant or too rushed to build a new one, and in doing so he had signed his own confession in numbers, the one language he'd never learned to lie in as well as he lied in speech. At 2:47 a.m, I walked the length of that too-long corridor for the first time without dread, straight to the door of the west wing I'd once been told not to approach, and I knocked. Joe opened it already awake, dressed, jaw still tight, and I held up the folder with both hands like it was something that could catch fire. "He used the same account," I said. "Marcus, the one from your third-quarter shortfall. He funneled the money he's accusing me of stealing through the exact shell company I flagged the day we met. It's all here. Dates, transfers, everything." He got sloppy because he never thought anyone was still counting. I watched her read it in silence, watched the exhausted, careful distance in her face give way to something sharper, colder, and entirely different from the coldness she'd worn for the board. "He's going to regret," she said slowly, "ever deciding you were a woman worth underestimating." "I need this done publicly," I said, "in a courtroom, in a boardroom, in front of a reporter, I don't care which. He doesn't get to disappear this quietly and start again somewhere new." Agreed. She was already reaching for her phone, already becoming, in real time, the woman the papers had built an entire epithet around. Then she stopped, hand halfway to the receiver, and looked at me with something raw underneath the calculation. "I should have believed you the moment I read the headline. I let the mask win instead. I'm sorry. You came back," I said. "That's what matters more." She called an emergency board session for the following morning. 6 hours later, security escorted Marcus Vantry's assistant out of the building for attempting to shred a filing cabinet, and by the time the sun came up over the river, Joe Vantry hadn't slept, and neither had I, and both of us were ready. The boardroom held 22 people the next afternoon, and every single one of them had, at some point in the last 3 days, believed the story that I had married for money and stolen to secure it. I walked in wearing a plain navy dress instead of anything Vantry bought, my own shoes, my own coat, because I wanted the room to remember exactly who had walked in off the street the first time they'd seen me, and I wanted to make it very clear that this time, I wasn't the one who needed to prove anything about my worth. Marcus arrived 9 minutes late, unbothered, a folder of his own tucked under one arm like a man still convinced he was the one holding the winning hand. "This is a waste of everyone's time," he said, before he'd even sat down. The internal investigation confirmed the discrepancies. "I don't understand why we're relitigating a fraud case in a boardroom instead of letting the authorities." "Because the authorities are already here," Joe said, and gestured toward the door, where 2 detectives I hadn't seen arrive stood with the quiet patience of people who had been briefed thoroughly and recently. "And because the fraud, Marcus, was never Wren's." I laid the documents on the table, one by one, the way I'd once laid columns of numbers beside my father's failing books, patient, precise, unhurried, letting each page speak in the only language a room like that one had ever fully respected. The shell account. The March shutdown. The 7 months of transfers that predated my marriage entirely, that predated my presence in that building by half a year, all of it routed through the same corroded pipeline Marcus had never bothered to rebuild, because he had never once imagined the invisible bride in the corner might be the one person capable of reading it. $22,000 a month, I said, for 14 months before I ever met any of you. Moved through a supplier that stopped existing before I set foot in this building. And $40,000, 3 weeks ago, routed through that same dead account and dressed up as my crime. I'd ask you to check the timestamps yourselves, except I already have. They're on page 4. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. Marcus's composure didn't crack all at once. It came apart the way cheap material always does, at the seams, in pieces, his voice rising with each denial until it stopped sounding like innocence and started sounding exactly like what it was. "This is fabricated. She's had access to internal accounts for months. She could have built this from anywhere. The timestamps predate her employment by 7 months, Marcus," Joe said. Quiet, absolute. The coldest sentence I had ever heard her speak, and I understood in that moment that this, precisely this, restraint held like a blade rather than swung like one, was the version of her fury that frightened people most. "You've spent 6 years telling this board I was the dangerous one in this family. I'd like the minutes to reflect that I was never the one stealing from it." He lunged for the folder on the table, not to read it, I think, but to destroy it, and it was Joe who moved first, faster than I'd ever seen her move, putting her own body between Marcus and the evidence, taking the shove meant to knock the papers away square across her shoulder instead. She didn't flinch. She didn't so much as raise her voice. She simply looked at him and said, "Sit down," in a tone that had every detective in the room reaching for their radios, and he sat, because 22 years of being raised to obey exactly one voice in that family had just been turned against him. They arrested him in front of the whole board, wrists in cuffs that had, hours earlier, belonged in my nightmare and not his hands, and I understood the particular, dizzying symmetry of that as they walked him out past the same window where I'd first seen Joe Vantry standing with the river at her back. "Mercy," I said quietly, once the doors closed behind him, watching Joe's hand curl into a fist at her side, watching her weigh, visibly, exactly how much more damage she wanted to do to a man who had tried to destroy both our lives. "Let the courts finish it. Don't become what he already is." She unclenched her hand, slow, deliberate, and reached instead for mine. "You're the only ledger I've ever met that balances kindness against justice and comes out even," she said, low enough that it belonged only to us. "Marry me again. Properly, this time. For the reasons that actually matter." "We're already married," I said, laughing despite everything, despite the wreckage of the last 3 days. "Not the way I intend to be," she said, and pressed her forehead to mine in front of a room full of people who had, 3 days earlier, believed I was the criminal in the family, and none of them said a single word, because there was nothing left to say. That night, in the West Wing that had become simply ours, she asked me with her whole voice, not just her hands, whether I wanted her the way the bond wanted her, and I said yes, and she asked again, because that was who she was, careful even in wanting, and I said yes again. And the third time I said it, I meant it with every unguarded, unafraid part of myself I had spent 26 years learning to hide. "Tell me to stop," she murmured against my throat, her scent gone thick and warm through the whole room, rain giving way entirely to something like summer. "And I will." "Don't stop," I said. "Don't ever stop." The mark she left at my scent gland was gentle where I had braced for something fiercer, and the bond that opened between us afterward felt less like a chain and more like a door finally swung wide after years of being told to knock. Through it, faint and true, I felt what she had never once said aloud in 6 years of being the Winter Ledger, that she had been waiting, without knowing it, for someone worth thawing for. Marcus Vantry was convicted 11 weeks later on 14 counts of fraud and embezzlement, stripped of every title the family had ever given him. And the last I heard of him, he was appealing a sentence long enough to make the appeal itself a formality. Beatrice Lang, whose loyalty to him had shown itself in the timing of certain leaked photographs, was dismissed within the same week. Her references withheld, her name quietly unwelcome in every household that mattered in that city. My father's debt, the $412,000 that had started all of it, had long since stopped meaning anything at all. Joe proposed to me properly on a Tuesday in October, kneeling in the orchid room among stems she had, against all odds, kept alive. A small, unassuming box in her open palm instead of a contract. "Vantris do not flinch," she said, echoing her father's old doctrine with a smile instead of armor behind it. "I don't flinch. Not from boardrooms, not from prison sentences, not from you. I never will again." We were bonded properly the following spring, in a ceremony with actual guests instead of 9 strangers and legal ink. Priya Okafor standing as witness in a suit she complained about for a week beforehand and cried through anyway, muttering to Mrs. Aldous, that in 15 years working for that family, she had never once seen Josephine Vantry wait for anyone, not at a door, not at a car, not for a single second, until me. She waits for you like the sun waits for morning, Priya told me afterward, gruff and unsentimental and entirely sincere. Don't ever let her stop. Della, my oldest friend, cried harder than anyone and told the whole reception, loudly, that she'd known since the wedding photo of me flinching on the front steps that the woman gripping my arm hadn't been holding on to control me, she'd been holding on because she was terrified of losing me, and that anyone with eyes could have seen it if the papers had bothered to look past the headline. A year on, the peony garden Jo built behind the orchid room bloomed for the first time. Every color I had once described to her as a childhood wish I'd stopped believing in, planted in the exact bed I'd once pointed to and said, half joking, that no one who owned a house like this would ever bother growing something so ordinary. She had bothered. She bothers, still, every single spring. She still calls me her little ledger sometimes, low and private, the words that once sounded like dismissal in a boardroom of strangers now meaning something closer to the truth. The only column, she says, that ever balanced right the first time she checked it. The lamp still sits on the nightstand in the room we share, chip and crack and all, though neither of us has needed it against the dark in longer than I can count. We keep it lit anyway. Some mornings I wake before her and find the room gold with early light, her hand still curled loosely around mine, the small warm circle from that ceramic base spilling across the sheets like it has nowhere better to be, and I understand, finally, all the way down, what my mother meant when she told a grieving 9-year-old that the ones who stay are the ones who matter. It was never about being rescued. It was never about being fixed, or forgiven, or made worth something by someone richer or colder or stronger than I was. It was only ever about being seen clearly, all the way through, and chosen anyway. The nightmare that once meant the end of everything became. Instead, the night everything true finally walked through my door and refused to leave. She never went back to her own room. She never will. The end.